Today, I will be talking about my favorite books that I read in 2023. I had a pretty good reading year as far as picking books that I loved, and I read about 50 books this year, and I will be talking about my top 10 plus one honorable mention. I kind of have been thinking about how to do this, and I've decided to make this list in no particular order because I kind of split my top 10 list whenever I was making it into most enjoyable and most impactful. Some books are books that have stayed with me and left an impact and in some ways changed the way that I see the world. And other books were just fun and they weren't trying to be life-changing books. And I don't want to discount books that weren't trying to be life-changing over something they weren't even trying to do. So it's very hard for me sometimes to rank these books against each other when they evoke very different emotions. So I am making this list in no particular order, but I will be talking about some of the ones that impacted me the most versus ones that I just found so much fun. There is a common theme that unites pretty much all of these books that I will talk about at the end of the video, but if you want to play along and guess what that is, you can, and I will give you a hint. It has very little to do with the content of the books. And with that, let's get into it. I will be going through these in the order that I read them this year. So I am starting with Moon of the Crusted Snow. This is a book that I read in February and have thought about all year long. If you would have told me in February that this book would be making my top 10 books of the year, I would have thought that I didn't have a very good reading year. Whenever I very first read this, I thought this book was just okay. But the longer I have thought about it and thought about its themes and the story, the more I want to reread this book. And I am looking forward to its sequel, Moon of the Turning Leaves, that is being released in the US this year. Moon of the Crusted Snow is a post-apocalyptic book that takes place in the Anishinaabe community in Canada. This book is slow, haunting, almost this creeping terror as things slowly get worse and worse in the community. One of the lines that really struck me was when one of the older people in the community said, she's like, these young people, they keep saying this is the apocalypse, this is the end of the world, but we have already experienced the end of the world and we're still here and we keep moving forward. And that's something I really have thought about because you can think about that on a small scale or a large scale. There are so many communities, nations, people groups throughout history that their world has ended sometimes rather suddenly. And then you can also think about it in the small scale, in the personal world endings. Like a single person can experience a tragedy that completely changed their world and they're still here and they keep moving forward. And it's just something that has really stuck with me and I think about a lot. Next book on the list is The Poppy War. This is also one that I read very early in the year. I read this in February and absolutely fell in love with it. This book is kind of told in two parts. This is a kind of historical fantasy. It's set in like a fantasy version of Asia and it features the fantasy version of the Sino-Japanese War. It is heavily inspired by those events. Our main character at the beginning of the book is trying to escape her bad home life and she gets into this military academy. So the first part of the book is her training and then the second part of the book is war. Whenever I started reading this book, I honestly thought it was more of a hero's journey type story, but the longer I read, the more I realized this is a corruption arc. I can't really explain why this book grabbed me so much, but this was one that I did not want to put down and I love. I read it so fast. I was just so captivated by this story. And I also kind of like that it was historical fantasy because I got to learn more about a period of history that I was not as familiar with. I ended up looking up stuff about the Sino-Japanese War because I read this book and I loved it. And then I proceeded to not read the next two books. I have this terrible habit of starting series and not finishing them. So hopefully in 2024, I will be finishing this series. We'll see. The next book that I read that makes this list has a very different vibe, even though it is historical fantasy, and that is The Adventures of Amina al-Sarafi. This book is way more fun than The Poppy War by like a long shot. It has some of my favorite fantasy tropes. It has getting the crew back together, found family, and just like swashbuckling adventure fantasy. This book was so much fun. This is historical fantasy. It is a pirate on the Indian Ocean. And while this book was just so fun, the author's note in the back of this book did say something that has stuck with me since I read this book, and I will read that to you. I have been reminded again and again and again, history is a construct, ever-changing and always subjective. Not only does it reveal the biases of its teller, audience, and intention, but also there is often much we simply don't know. While the past decade has seen astounding developments in the study of the medieval Indian Ocean world, I have no doubt that by the time this book is published, some detail I believe factually sound will be disproven. She goes on in her author's note about her study, what she studied, what first-person accounts she read, things that you can read if you're interested in the medieval Indian Ocean time period. But she also talks about some things she took liberties on in her book, and it really has made me consider what we consider historically accurate. Like, there is, to some extent, we can call things historically inaccurate or historically accurate, but it is just something that I think about, like, whenever we make the claim, what are we basing that on? And you know, how certain are we of history? So while this book definitely fit the enjoyable category, the author's notes definitely hit on the impactful category. Speaking of impactful, the next book that I read definitely is 100% in the impactful category. That is How Minds Change. This is a nonfiction book about the psychology of mind change, and it is probably the book that has changed my outlook on life the most. In this book, it goes through how people end up changing their mind on things and how you really can't change anyone else's mind. You can present all the facts and logic in the world, and it won't matter unless that person is willing and open to hearing that information and possibly changing their mind on things. So this book goes into how to be open to new information and not get stuck in our biases, because there are things that I believe without evidence. It's just like, oh yeah, I heard that once and now I believe it. And I haven't really sat down and thought about why. And that's what this book covers. Most people haven't actually sat down and really delved deep into why do I hold this belief. And a lot of beliefs we hold don't really impact the way we live our lives, but some beliefs do. And those are really the ones that we should be examining for ourselves and going, why do I believe this? What evidence do I have for this? Am I interested in the truth even if I'm wrong? So, excellent nonfiction book I recommend if you're into that kind of thing. But moving back into the more enjoyable side of things, the next book I have on my list is Crooked Kingdom. And maybe I'm including this because of my own biases. So I have had a somewhat rocky relationship with the Grishaverse. I read Shadow and Bone many years ago, and I was just as bad at finishing series at that time as I am now. So I read Shadow and Bone and then didn't continue with the series. And then whenever season 1 of the Netflix show came out, I did read the first book, Six of Crows, and was kind of unimpressed. So I didn't read any of the other books until this year when season 2 came out. I decided I was going to actually read all of the books in the Grishaverse. So I finished the Shadow and Bone trilogy. I had a fun time with it. Reread Six of Crows. Was still just mediocre on that book. And then I read Crooked Kingdom. And Crooked Kingdom blew me out of the water. This is like the best book I've read by Leigh Bardugo so far. I've not read anything beyond Grishaverse, so I don't know about those books. But I was so into this story. I had to know what happened next. I was so excited by the plot, I was really with the characters. I felt like I understood them so much better in this book than I did in Six of Crows. I loved this book. So maybe this is on my list because I had low expectations for it going in, but I also spent a fair amount of time with the Grishaverse this year and have fallen in love with the world of the Grishaverse. It is a really cool world to get lost in, and I honestly think that I will be rereading Kurika Kingdom one of these days. Next book I have here falls under both impactful and enjoyable. This is Warrior Girl Unearthed. This is the first book I read by Angeline Boulley. I know her Firekeeper's Daughter is much more popular than this book, but this is the one I picked up and I really like this book. This is about a girl living in an Anishinaabe community in Michigan, and it is set in present day. Our main character is Perry Firekeeper Birch. She is a no-nonsense, say-it-like-it-is type person, but she's also really passionate about her community. She unwillingly ends up taking a summer internship at the tribal museum, and while she's working with the director of the museum, she learns about artifacts and human remains of people from her community that are in museums and personal collections around the world, not with her people. And the director of the museum is trying to go through the legal avenues to try to get those things returned to their tribe. And our main character is very frustrated with how slow this system is taking. We also get to see just like her friendships with other people in her community and her sister, and just more of the community, not just this issue, but this was something that I was not aware of prior to reading this book. And this is one of the reasons that I like reading, because I like getting to see things that expand my world. And this book definitely did that. It was fun and entertaining and had a passionate and lovable main character, but it also brought up something that I was not aware of previously that I got to learn about the world. The next book on my list is the first book I read by Fonda Lee, and that is Untethered Sky. As of recording this is the only book I've read by Fonda Lee, but I definitely want to change that because I absolutely loved Untethered Sky. This is about a girl who, whenever she is young, she sees her parents killed by manticore, and she is determined to avenge them, so she becomes a manticore hunter. This community hunts manticore using rocks, which are these giant birds, and she develops a relationship with this bird. This is a coming of age story. It is a revenge story, but it's also an exploration of grief and love and letting go. It is a very short book, but it packs such an emotional punch, and I think it didn't need to be longer than this to pack the punch that it had. I fell in love with this story, and I will definitely be checking out more of Fonda Lee's works. And the next book I have for you is one of the books that I have back here. I actually did not own this at the time that I read it. Whenever I get all of them, this will have an entire image on the front, which I'm looking forward to. On like the spines, there's an image across all of them. But right now, I'm missing too many volumes to really see it clearly, unfortunately. But I decided to use some of my Christmas money to buy the Temeraire series, which is one of my favorite series of all time. And this is the only ones they had in store, so I have to fill in some of the missing books. But they did happen to have the book that I'm going to have on this list, which is Victory of Eagles. This is the 5th book in the Temeraire series. I did only read the first 5 books in the series this year, although I have read all of the books in previous years. And I believe Victory of Eagles is my favorite. So this book is kind of a accumulation of everything that happened in the first 5 books. These stories are also historical fantasy. This is set during the Napoleonic War, and our main character is a naval captain who accidentally becomes a dragon rider and has to join the Dragon Air Force to fight for the British against Napoleon. While this book sounds like, oh, it's set during this like strategic military time in history, this book is actually about the friendship of Lawrence and his dragon Temeraire. Temeraire is like my favorite dragon of all time. I love Temeraire to death. And I love the push and pull of Lawrence and Temeraire. Lawrence grew up in a fairly well-off family in England, and he definitely has like a very proper way of doing things. And Temeraire often challenges Lawrence and says like, okay, but why does the world have to be this way? Why are we doing it this way? Why are we fighting Napoleon? Just like all of these things, like Temeraire is very inquisitive and intelligent, but also just like not accepting of this is the way the world works. He needs to understand it more than that. And Temeraire and Lawrence really have this like push and pull relationship where they challenge each other to be better. And this book is accumulation of like everything that happened in the first 5 books. I love it so much. This is also the first book where we get a perspective from the dragons in this world. And that perspective is written so brilliantly. And I'm going to be rereading all of these books, the entire series in 2024, and I already know that I will have an excellent time. The next book on the list definitely falls much more in the impactful category than the enjoyment category, although I did have fun with this book. That is The 3-Body Problem. One of the things that I've really gotten into this year is astronomy, outer space, the cosmos, the study of the cosmos. And this book fits right along with that. And one of the things that I find the most fascinating is like mysteries in the cosmos, things that we don't understand yet. And this book talks all about that. I do not know what the 3-body problem was before I read this book, but whenever I was reading this book, I was looking up so many of like the concepts that were introduced in this book. And most of them are like real world scientific mathematical concepts that we actually have. And just, I was learning so much. And the 3-body problem makes you realize that things are less certain than we like to believe. The other thing that was introduced in this story is like the turkey and the farmer. So if you were a turkey scientist, you would assume every time the farmer shows up, you get food. But one day the farmer is going to show up and decide to make Thanksgiving dinner and you will be the food. So this book was basically talking about that concept and like, why are we so certain about the things that we see simply because they happen consistently? Doesn't necessarily mean they will continue to happen that way. Unfortunately, I have a terrible habit of finishing series. So this is the only book that I read in this series this year, but I definitely want to be continuing on with this series because it is very eye-opening. This was definitely more of a book about ideas than it was about characters, although I enjoyed following our main character in this book. And for the final book in my top 10 before we get into the honorable mentions, this is A Study in Drowning. This is a book that I absolutely loved. I loved all of these books. That's why they're on this list. I don't typically go for books that are described as atmospheric, but this book I would totally describe as atmospheric. And like, I literally, while reading this book, thought it was like stormy and rainy. And then I looked out the window and the sun was shining and I was confused because I was in this book and just felt the atmosphere in the world. It was real, it was palpable. This is about an architecture student who gets the opportunity to redesign her favorite author's house. And whenever she's there, she also meets this literature student who she does not get along with at first because she thinks he's there to dig up dirt on her favorite author, unveil this local legend and this hero. This book is about so much. There's so many layers to this book. I have a full review, which I will have linked in the cards and in the description if you're interested. But I just feel like I could reread this book and get something else out of it because the story is so layered. I also felt like there was some similarities that reminded me to Jane Eyre. It's definitely not a Jane Eyre retelling, but there were some things that just put me in mind of that story. And the author is coming out with a Macbeth retelling in 2024, which I am so excited about, mostly because I read A Study in Drowning and loved it so much and feel like she could really tackle Macbeth well. So I cannot wait for that. And finally, I'm going to get to the honorable mentions. and that is the Murderbot Diaries. I have Artificial Condition here because that's the one my library had whenever I went to pick these books up from the library. I don't really know which is my favorite Murderbot book, and honestly, it might be Fugitive Telemetry, which I know is an unpopular opinion, but I feel like I went into the book with proper expectations. I knew it was not really going to be advancing the storyline and that it was an in-between book that was written after one of the other books, one of the novels that I don't remember the name of. But I had a really fun time with Murderbot this year. I read, I think, about 5 of the novellas. I read like all of the novellas, and I had a really fun time with them. They are fairly episodic, and Murderbot ends up doing the same thing over and over again. But I love his character, and I love spending time with him, or them, it. It's not a he, but the audio narrator is a he. So Murderbot is a big softie. He calls himself Murderbot, but that's because he is a security unit who hacked into his governor module and decided he is just going to sit down and watch TV. And he's a big softie because he ends up still acting as a security unit and protecting the humans around him, even though he doesn't have to anymore because his governor model isn't telling him he has to. So I had a lot of fun with these, and if you're looking for like fun, lighthearted science fiction robot books, antisocial robots who just want to watch TV instead of interacting with humans, these are a lot of fun. And now for the reveal of what all of these books have in common. They are all library books. Support your public library, and you do not have to own a lot of books to be a booktuber. You can read the majority of your books from the library, because that's definitely what I did this year. I own none of these, even though they're on my top 10 list this year. So I just think it's worth stating again. I know it's been said around BookTube before, but I think it's worth stating again. You don't have to own a lot of books to be a booktuber. Let me know if you've read any of these. Let me know what you plan on reading in 2024. I'm looking forward to chatting with you in the comments, and I hope to see you in another video. Happy reading!